and welcome. I don't think I said anything there. Welcome to the Economy Scrutiny Committee. I'm sure I've met most of you, but my name's Richard Smith from Kirklees, and I'm the chair of the meeting. So I'm going to kick off. We have enough people here to make the meeting correct, which is good, and it also means we're going to be recording the session. So I'm hoping that everyone can understand how the buttons work. In front of you there are 5 buttons, and the bottom left hand one of those is the one you press to indicate you want to speak. I don't know whether Khaled has got any further instructions. I don't know whether it queues up people or how it works. We'll crack on and see how we get on. So we're going to go straight into the meeting. I'm sure there may be a couple of people still to join us, but I'm conscious that we have to be leaving this room at 12 on the dot, and we've got quite a lot to look at. So go to the agenda. Apologies for absence. As far as I'm aware, we have 2 apologies from Councillor Zafar Iqbal from Bradford and Councillor Manisha Kaushik from Kirklees. I'm not aware of any other apologies. Yeah, I'm going to come to that in a minute. Yeah. We have 2 new members, which I'm going to cover under item number 5 regarding scrutiny and governance arrangements. So welcome to new members, and I will come back and speak through that at the appropriate time. Number 2 on the agenda is declaration of disclosable pecuniary interests. If anyone has any interest to declare, please would you make that known at this point? So take that as a no, thank you. Exclusion of the press and the public. Well, I can't see anyone from the press here or the public, but I don't think there's anything on this agenda that would prevent them from attending. So we'll say that it's an open meeting. Moving on to the notes of the Incar meeting, which was held on the 22nd of September this year. I had a look through these myself, and they looked fairly accurate to me. If anyone has any issue with these, can you please call it out now? I'm looking through page 1. Any issues with page 2 or page 3? And I've read these yesterday, so I'm quite happy with the minutes as they stand. Any comments on those? Yes, Don.
Excuse me. I don't have any problems with what's written. I'm just curious as to what will happen with them. Do they just get filed now, or do they get passed on to another group of officers or councillors?
Well, ordinarily in Court meetings, they will be stored wherever Khaled tells me they're going to be stored. I don't know what the process is for in-court meetings. They're informal notes. So yeah, part of the public record in this pack. So item number 5, which is on page 5 of the pack. So we have a report for this, which is to note changes in scrutiny and governance arrangements. There are a couple of things here I alluded to earlier. So firstly, we have membership changes. So Councillor Tony Hames will replace Councillor Sam Harvey from Wakefield. So welcome, and thanks for coming. Councillor Tony Wallace replaces Councillor Graham Isherwood, also from Wakefield. So welcome to Councillor Wallace. There does remain 1 vacancy, which is the Calderdale Labour Group. Yesterday I wrote to the group leader and to the whip for the Labour group in Calderdale, and I asked them to send their nominations as soon as they're able. Principally because of what we're going to come on to speak to in a minute, which is the court requirements for this meeting. It's quite a high threshold. I believe it's 2/3, which is 11 members. Am I right, Khaled? I think it's 11 out of 15. So that means that if we're not correct, then we cannot hold a formal meeting. We cannot, we don't have the same powers of scrutiny. So it's quite important that we have all the members, which is why we sent notes out to people. Good morning. Hi there. No worries. So we definitely call it now because we've got 12 people. So amendments to scrutiny standing orders and regarding substitutes. On the 9th of December, there is a proposition going to the Combined Authority meeting, which is to propose a change to the rules for substitutes. It's all written down here, but essentially what it means is that where a member has no substitute from their own party, then they can nominate someone. So this will apply mostly to the smaller parties in section 2.5 on page 6. Gives you a little bit of an indication of that. So this is for noting, it's not for anything, any action for us to do. I would assume that that's going to go through on the 9th of December, and when we next meet, well, prior to our next meeting, we will be made aware of that. The only other item to note in this report is on page 7, number 10, which is just the recommendations, which is to note the changes in membership, which we've done, and to note the amendments to the scrutiny standing orders, which we've just discussed. So I propose that that item is complete, unless anyone has any comments or questions. Okay, so chair's comments. That'll be me. Not got a massive amount I want to say. I had a meeting yesterday. Well, myself and Councillor Baines, the deputy chair, had a meeting with Tracy Brabin, the mayor, which is a good meeting. We spent half an hour just getting to know each other a little bit, discussing the mayor's priorities, and I outlined the priorities that we are going to look at, which we'll come on to further on in the meeting. We agreed that we're going to try and work collaborative, which is a good thing. Tracy will be coming to one of our meetings. I think it's in March. March meeting, and then we'll be able to ask lots of questions and probe into the pledges that she's made and the progress that she's making with them, and any other questions that we may come across along the way. The other thing I was going to mention is our work program is, I wouldn't say formalized, I was going to say formalized, but it's not really formalized. It's set out in this document pack. It's a live document. It's something we're going to come back to, and we can amend it if we so wish. We're going to have a look at that shortly. There are meetings with the other chairs of the other scrutiny committees which have been set up. We've had a couple already. That's really useful. In the past, there was one scrutiny committee in the West Yorkshire Authority, and now there are 3. So it's useful for us to understand what each other are doing, if there's any crossover, and just to have a general catch up with the other scrutiny chairs as well. Just briefly as well, the letter that we discussed previously to Michael Gove has gone out. It was signed by myself and the other chairs, and it was actually sent from the mayor. Essentially what this does is ask for a relaxation of the rules regarding the number of people required to make the meeting quorate. It's suggesting that we have half of the members instead of 2/3, which is obviously a much easier threshold to meet. And it is also asking for permission to have hybrid or virtual meetings, because at the moment we have to come to a central meeting point in person. And whilst we were in the COVID pandemic, we had a higher rate of attendance for obvious reasons, because people didn't have to travel as far. It's a large geographical area, etc. So if those 2 things are met with a positive response, then we'll let you know. I don't think there's an awful lot more for me to say. I had written quite a lot more down, but I don't think I'm going to mention that, because we're going to come on to that to speak through in the agenda items. So I'm going to go on to item number 7, which is the work programme, which starts on page 9 of your document pack. So looking firstly at this report, and I feel as though I've been talking quite a lot. I don't like just talking to people. So just feel free to shout out if anybody's got any comments along the way. So the report is to approve our work programme and to possibly consider any additional agenda items. As I mentioned previously, the work programme is set at the beginning of the year, so it has been set down here in writing, but it is a live document. We'll look at it at each meeting and we can amend it and make changes. So this is the opportunity to do that. The meat of this is actually in the appendix. So in Appendix 1, page 8, which is page 20 of the pack, it refers specifically to this committee meeting. The other parts of that appendix refer to corporate scrutiny and transport scrutiny. So I'm going to turn to page 20. And this is very much along the lines of discussions that we had collectively, discussions that Khalid and I have had with officers, etc. The thing that we're going to look at in detail today, and the thing that reports are written to cover, is the COVID-19 recovery, economic growth, job creation, skills, and other opportunities. There are a few subtopics under there. We're going to look at that in this meeting and the January meeting. Quite a few different areas that I'm not going to read out because you can see them all there. Impacts of inward investment is going to be a workshop in February. That was a possible workshop, but I'm pretty sure that I would like that to go ahead. And I think that it would be a useful thing to do. We're also got a couple of items on there which was discussed regarding rural issues, which we're going to look at in the next meeting. I did mention this to Tracy yesterday as well, just to understand specific rural issues, how they've been considered regarding agriculture, food, and things we discussed at the last meeting. And also we're going to look at the housing pledge. This is quite a complex area. This is something that Steve and I discussed with the Mayor yesterday. Obviously there's a pledge and there is some influence that the Mayor can hold over this at a West Yorkshire level, but it's also in the gift of local authorities, local plans, local planning professionals. So there's quite a lot of things to consider in there. But I did get a little bit more information from the Mayor yesterday. So there is possibilities there. So that's something that's also in there. So we've got quite a lot to look at. These subheadings and these headings just cover the headlines, but obviously there's a huge ream of documentation here that we also need to look through. So has anybody got any comments on that work programme before we get on to the actual meat of the meeting itself? Thanks, Khalid. Bob.
Yes, can we look at growth of the green economy in particular in respect of solar, well, PV and heat pumps? And the reason I'm asking this question is I currently work with a fossil fuel supplier. They're looking at setting up an operation to move away from fossil fuels into renewables. And one of the challenges we've come across is that the skill sets required to deliver green solutions are absent in the whole of the area. And I think that's nationally as well. If we look at matters nationally, Yorkshire and the Humber's got the second highest output of CO2 per capita in the UK, and that clearly has to change. And I think this is an opportunity for us to look at the green market because of where we are in terms of manufacturing, and actually drive things forward and invest in that sector.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thanks for that suggestion. We will, I think it probably would be possible to cover that under the items that we already list, but I've made a note of that and we will ensure that that's included as well. I don't know whether that's going to be something that Brian speaks through a little bit as well. I think it probably might be. So we might even have a chance to discuss that in this meeting as well. So thanks for that. I had a chat with a fellow who lives just up the road from me about heat pumps the other day. So I understand a little bit more than I did because I read up about it when I got home. But anyway, so any other comments before we move on? Which, if I've got this correct, will be agenda item number 8, which starts on page 25, which is the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Plan, which is 10:15, which gives us loads of time to do the meat of the meeting, as opposed to me waffling. Brian.
Thank you, Chair. Can everybody hear me okay? I'll take the paper as read. I think it'd be useful just to talk members through some of the highlights, just in terms of the economy. At the peak of the pandemic, there was something like 350,000 people on furlough. And the latest stats we had, just as the scheme came to an end, there was around 40,000 people that were on the furlough scheme. But what we found is that that's not translated into a big increase in unemployment numbers. And actually, the labour market's very, very tight at the moment. There's acute skill shortages in a number of areas, well, across all sectors, but particularly in some sectors. So obviously furlough coming to an end, as we were gearing up through the Employment Hub to provide support for those individuals. Over 5,000 individuals we were expecting to come through the Employment Hub, which is a service where we match individuals to training opportunities and job opportunities. We've not seen that big uptick in unemployment figures. Alongside that, obviously, we're seeing increase in energy prices, particularly gas prices are going through the roof at the moment. So those energy intensive businesses are finding it quite challenging at the moment. And also attracting and retaining people is also an issue across the labour market. In terms of our response to some of those issues, we recently launched our entrepreneurship programme, and you'll have seen in the paper that we've got 3 programmes to encourage and support people to start their own business. The first part of the programme is encouraging enterprise and supporting people to consider self-employment as an option. The second part of the programme is to support people who are starting early stage businesses and young businesses to help them grow. And the third part of the programme is to support high growth businesses. And the amount of resource that the Combined Authority approved and authorised for that activity was 6 million through the devolved gain share funding. That programme was launched last week. We also put the Combined Authority also put 13.5 million into 2 programmes called the Employment Hub and Reboot, and that was initially to respond to the pandemic and the risk of people coming off furlough. And to provide short training courses for people to get back into work and back into employment. We're also seeing, obviously, energy prices going up. Inflation figures were out, I think, this morning at 4.2% as well. So whilst the economy, on the face of it, seems to be bouncing back significantly quicker than people expected, we've still got some real issues in terms of deprivation across the region. The ending of the uplift to universal credit, that £20, will have a disproportionately large impact on some of our communities. And I think there's just over 230,000 people that will be affected by the withdrawal of that universal credit. So in designing and developing some of our business support programs and some of our training programs, it's really important that we focus on reaching some of those hard to reach communities. So when we commissioned the entrepreneurship program, we've set targets in terms of 50% women entrepreneurs, 20% from BAME backgrounds, to make sure that we're actually delivering on that inclusive growth agenda. We're also looking at new approaches to delivering business support so that it's more rooted in some of those local communities. With the growth managers, 21 growth managers actually sat within each of the 5 local authority areas, making sure that we're making those connections with all the different support providers. Skills, I should obviously touch on skills. The adult education budget was devolved to the Combined Authority, which is £65 million a year. And in September, we commissioned providers to deliver programs, the FE colleges and private training providers to deliver adult skills training across West Yorkshire. All the contracts in partnership with the local authorities. All the contracts and agreements have been signed, and learners are now actually starting on programs. So we've got the infrastructure in place to manage that commissioning. And what's going to be really important going forward is that we're commissioning the skills that industry and business needs, so that we're training people for the jobs that we've got in the labour market to plug some of those gaps. And Peter and the policy research team do a lot of work in terms of labour market assessment, identifying what the current and future skills needs are, working with the local authorities and the FE colleges and businesses to determine where we've got skills gaps and what we can do to address them. At times we've had to respond very quickly. So I think I referred to the HGV driver shortage, and we had a discussion at the last scrutiny committee. We flexed the adult education budget, so we were able to support training providers to deliver those programs. That was only part of the solution because it was a much more complex issue in terms of the shortage of HGV drivers, but it did demonstrate that we were able to respond to that immediate crisis. The other thing I should say is that we've been supporting the local authorities in dispersing the area restrictions grants that were dispersed to support businesses through the pandemic. And we're also in discussions with a number of local authority partners about how we can use some of that funding to draw down additional funding, so we can use it as potential matching to bring in other resource for some of the entrepreneurship programs. You'll see in the report there's a summary of some of the activity and the Q2 performance in terms of number of individuals engaged, and obviously I'm happy to provide whatever detailed information members need. I don't know if Peter wants to comment on some of the economic factors with regards to the labour market and the latest information, if I may, Chair. Thanks.
Yeah, just a couple of points to add to Brian's very comprehensive survey of the economic situation. I think one of the underlying problems is that economic activity is very low at the moment. So some observers calculate that nationally it's about 1 million people fewer than it would have been if the trend of growth prior to the pandemic had continued. So we've got 1 million fewer people active in the labour market than one would expect. And the reason for that is it's both older and young people who've withdrawn from the labour market. So young people, particularly males, are staying in full-time education, but older people, many older people have retired early, so they've perhaps been made redundant from work, but not gone back into employment. So a big challenge will be in attracting some of those people back into the labour market. And I think that is one of the underlying things that is causing the labour shortages that Brian referred to. In terms of the nature of those labour shortages, the real surge in sort of recruitment activity and vacancies since the restrictions were lifted has been around lower skilled occupations more than higher skilled occupations, so particularly elementary type roles, as well as the sort of roles that Brian mentioned in terms of driving occupations. And again, it's partly because there's people leaving those occupations perhaps and not returning to the labour market. But overall, we've got a very vibrant labour market in a way at the moment, as well as it being tight. We've seen record levels of people leaving unemployment into jobs at the moment nationally, and also record levels of job-to-job movements. So the labour market is very much a sort of hive of activity. And I think one of the challenges is ensuring that people are reallocated effectively into the areas where there are shortages and where the prospects are best. Additional things to mention just around the business side. So Brian mentioned the recruitment challenges, but in addition to that, we're seeing sort of supply chain blockages affecting businesses. So this comes out very clear through the Chamber of Commerce's quarterly survey. So supply chain blockages, inflation of input costs, and all of that could have an impact on the performance and profitability of manufacturing. And then the final point, just supplementing what Brian said around deprivation of universal credit. According to JRF calculations, some of the wards in Bradford have more than 70% of their families with children are affected by the removal of the uplift. So there are real concentrations within West Yorkshire people who are affected by the changes to universal credit and working tax credit as well. So they're just some additional points. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian and Peter, for that. Got a hand up already. I'll hand over to you. Carry on.
Sorry, Chair. It's just in terms of the numbers of those affected. Do we have figures for those affected who were in work and those affected who were out of work?
So those figures are available, but I don't actually have them to hand, but we can certainly circulate them to the committee. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation did quite detailed analysis immediately before the removal of the uplift. So for example, just looking at some figures here, the proportion of families with children in West Yorkshire affected by the reduction was 56%, but it rose to 82% in Bradford West and 71% in Bradford East, for example. So a really concentrated impact in parts of West Yorkshire. We can certainly share that report, a link to that report.
Councillor Collins, I think you were first. I'll come back to you in a second.
Thank you. I think mine's quite an easy question, actually. The entrepreneurship scheme and the training schemes, are they all highlight? Do you find out the information about those through the employment hub? I'm just asking you, so if I became unemployed tomorrow, I've been employed for decades, would I just have that one place to go? Or do you have to somehow find a more complicated route?
Thank you, Councillor. No, there's a number of routes in. It could be via the job centre, referral through the job centre, or it could be through the employment hub, or it could be through an intermediary. It could be through a local community centre, or it could be through any number of other kind of sources, from the local bank referring people, local accountant, or Job Centre Plus. So there's a number of different routes in, and I think it's a really good question, actually, because in terms of the marketing and promotion of the programmes, to raise awareness amongst different groups, we'll need a different approach depending on the target audience. So I think, so if we're looking to the high growth startups, we'll be looking to encourage, graduates to establish their own business and get spin outs from the university. That'd be a different sort of marketing message and a different route into, say, somebody who's just been made redundant and is considering self-employment as an option. And we just need to make sure that we've got that safety net and that we don't leave anybody behind in terms of the support that's available, whatever their ambition and aspiration.
Thanks, Chair. My question is on the entrepreneurship programme as well, and particularly the first work stream, which is promoting enterprise as a career option. I think I mentioned this briefly at our first meeting, is to what extent, well, first of all, what is your target audience for that programme, and how early do we start in terms of getting into schools to present that as a valid option? I think very often self-employment within schools is regarded as not a real option, but something you fall into if you can't get a job anywhere else. And how are we sort of going to promote that in schools?
I think there are different approaches to encouraging entrepreneurship in schools, and there's a number of programs that have been run successfully in the past, like Young Enterprise, for example, working with schools. And also there's a program in the North East called Future Business Magnets, where business people effectively are seconded in to work with schools, working with young people to help them develop a business plan, come up with a business idea, and then go through a competition and a series of rounds, and there are lots of schools in the competition. And as part of the process, the young people are, having to understand basic accounting, basic marketing, how to test a business idea and do market research and such like, but also they're learning how to interact with one another, they're learning social skills, the picking up those entrepreneurship skills. So the target audience is obviously young people, as well as older people that are entering the labour market as well. But we would promote the schemes to schools through mechanisms like that.
Yeah, I understand the schemes. In fact, I was involved in one in West Yorkshire probably 10 years or so, which was called the Enterprise Advisor Scheme, and I was a consultant on that scheme. But what we found when we were going into schools is there was a conflict between what we were trying to encourage in schools and the national curriculum and the exams and everything else. And very often the skills that you identify with entrepreneurs, especially if you bring entrepreneurs in to speak to the school children, their skills were not reflected in what the schools were trying to deliver through the national curriculum, exams, etc. In fact, sometimes very the opposite. They were saying to young people, well, I developed this skill in spite of what I was being told in school. And if you look at the big role models like Branson and people like that, they don't have great academic records. And so we found ourselves even to the extent that we were seen as a bit, I can't think of the right word, but almost undermining the academic national curriculum. And so it wasn't so much the pupils and the students in the school were having to educate or influence, but the teachers, and very often what you found was the cohort of students you were being sort of given to were those who weren't doing very well academically. It was almost like, well, this is somewhere where we can push our lower achieving children, and it was getting that right message across to the schools. And I don't honestly, I think in the Enterprise Advisor Scheme with West Yorkshire Business Link and Education Business Link, we didn't manage that either well enough or with enough background or knowledge, and I wouldn't want us to fall down on that again.
I think that's a really good challenge, and I think we will need to look at some of the lessons learned from other programs, particularly in terms of how it aligns with national curriculum and trying to ensure that it's congruent with the national curriculum. So looking at, for example, understanding accounts and finance, how does that fit with mathematics and arithmetic? Writing an advert to sell a product, how does that complement English skills, literacy skills and such like? So I do think we need to look at some of the lessons from the past, and in designing the program going forward. I think it's a good challenge, and it's something that we'll certainly take on board, and I can come back with some more information on the specific program, which hopefully will address some of the points raised. So thank you for that.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Brian, for your report, and also Peter. I just wanted to follow up on entrepreneurship as well. I mean, I think it's great that it's a priority. We also know that it can be quite a vulnerable sector, and we know during the pandemic, self-employed weren't perhaps supported as well as they could have been. And I think something in the report, it mentions that some analysis from the ONS suggested that self-employed were 3 times as likely to report reduced income and twice as likely to use the savings to cover living costs. I think you spoke about this a little bit about the safety net, but I don't know if you could say a little bit more about what additional support offer there is, given that it is such a vulnerable sector and it's something that we want to prioritise as well.
I think it's when we look at people that are wanting to start their own business, I think that I touched on this at the last meeting, that there are crudely two categories. There are those that are pushed into self-employment through no other option, and those that are pulled into self-employment who typically would have a higher level of skills, more resources, probably a higher level of motivation than somebody who's pushed into self-employment. And one of the roles that I think we need to fulfill is to actually, when we sit down and work with an individual who potentially is pushed into self-employment through no other alternative, that we're able to provide them with as much support as we can to make sure that they make an informed decision about whether or not it's sensible to go into a business in, say, a very labour-intensive sector that's highly competitive, which might be operating at the fringes of some kind of marginal economy, and they might end up earning less than they would if they actually got a job. And we don't want to encourage and push people into, bluntly, self-employment slavery. So I think it's really important that we provide a huge amount of support in terms of skills, training, apprenticeships, and making those linkages to some of the skills programs. Because ultimately, when somebody starts a business, what determines the success is the level of skills, the level of motivation, and the level of resources. Now, to my mind, I think it's good if we can get people coming onto these programs, and even if they don't subsequently set up a business, if by going through a training and development program, they're learning new skills, and we're helping to build a self-esteem, build a self-confidence, get them back into the labour market, and give them that encouragement and motivation. And I think it's an opportunity. If you get somebody's interest and stimulate that bit of desire, that's where I think we can really intervene. And at the end of the day, it is about changing lives, making a difference, and taking people from some of the most disadvantaged backgrounds and giving them hope. Now, the answer isn't to say, go and set up your own business, it will be fine, because we've seen from the enterprise allowance programs of the past that that really was just unemployment relief. The government got people off the register by giving them 40 quid a week and persuading them to set up their own business as a window cleaner or something. But actually they ended up earning less, operating in this marginal economy, and that wasn't the right thing to do. If we can get people interested in enterprise and get them into programs and training programs, we're creating opportunities for people to hopefully get retrained, learn skills, build the confidence, build the self-esteem, and then find them some work. And that's why I think we need to be doing that. But we need to be more sophisticated in terms of our approach, so that we're not just focusing on the glamorous high-tech stuff. This is about getting people back into employment-related activity, getting them economically active, and pushing everyone into self-employment is not the answer for everybody. Having said that, there's always exceptions. Some people are very successful in business and have a high level of motivation because they've been marginalized. It's seen as breaking through the glass ceiling. It's seen as overcoming disadvantage. And there's lots of successful entrepreneurs out there that perhaps didn't go to university, were dyslexic, or had some other disadvantage, and they saw entrepreneurship as a route to overcoming disadvantage. And I think as a combined authority and a LEP, we have to be flexible to be able to adapt all of our programs to meet the needs of the different sort of groups of entrepreneurs. But it's not an exact science, and I think it's a really good it's a really good observation, because there are times when it would be wrong to encourage somebody to set up their own business just to get them off the dole queue if ultimately it led them into the equivalent of modern day slavery. To be blunt about it. Sorry. Thank you, Chair.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I guess I also just wanted to go back to what Peter said. I think you said that in terms of the low skilled jobs, that was the most, you were seeing people moving off employment there in particular, rather than high skill. Was that correct? Did you say that?
So I think what is true to say, the vacancy increase has mainly been for lower skilled roles. So there are plenty of opportunities out there at the moment. If, in say in hospitality, I mean, it's unfair to characterize jobs as low, low skilled, but that's the way they're sort of categorized. So in, say, hospitality, sort of routine roles in sort of storage occupations and things like that. That's where the real strength is. But just going back to the self-employment point, I think it's important to note that overall employment nationally is still below pre-pandemic levels. And the main factor that is driving that is self-employment. So employees, the number of employees has recovered very strongly, but self-employment. So that implies that there's been a reduction in people in self-employment. They've moved into employee roles. So how that is going to adjust as the economy continues to recover is quite an important question, I think.
I think there was a slightly related point to that. A couple of my friends set up business a long time ago, and they were both sort of forced into it because the companies they were working for were coming to a point where they were ceasing trading. So they both did more or less what you've described, forced into it. They had skills, started selling those skills themselves, and they've become successful. So, I think all of these things are relevant. The bit I was thinking about was with the question from Harpreet was about, I think you've mentioned about startups and encouraging people into entrepreneurship, but the people who are already there now and struggling, it's, what is the sort of support potential for those people? I don't really know which sectors we're talking about. Possibly, more than I do about what sectors those people are in. But clearly, if people are in business and the pandemic has made those business activities virtually impossible to conduct, then they will be struggling. So it's a different point, as opposed to, encouraging people is good to start up, but those people have been trading for several years and have struggled and are struggling. What's the things that we are doing to sort of help them a little bit?
Thank you. Yeah, we've got across the 5 districts, we've got 21 growth managers and growth hubs. They work proactively with some of the existing businesses. I think the business stock is around 100,000 in West Yorkshire, and the growth managers work with growth businesses. They'll go into a business. A bit like a GP is probably the best analogy. They do a diagnostic of that business's needs, identify what other support they might need to make them more successful, and that could be other programs such as REBIS, which is an environmental audit, which would enable them to reduce their energy costs. It could be changing to LED light bulbs, or changing systems and processes to become more, to be more energy efficient. So we've got a number of programs like that we can offer existing businesses. We've also got a business growth program where we offer capital grants for businesses. But of course, at the moment, we've got uncertainty because the European money's finished, and we're still waiting to hear from the government about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And those funds would be used to support businesses with capital grants. So if they're looking to invest in a new CNC machinery or some plant and equipment, we could make a contribution towards the cost of that, provided the company can demonstrate that it wouldn't have gone ahead anyway without that public intervention. So it's got to pass that additionality test, and it's got to create jobs. And linked to that, the company has to make a commitment to the inclusive growth agenda. So we'd expect them to pay the living wage, for example, or we'd expect them to sign up to other social inclusion conditions as part of the grant. Because what we don't want to do is just give capital grant money to businesses who can afford to fund it themselves anyway. So they have to pass that sort of additionality test. So that's a business growth program. In terms of the pandemic and enabling businesses to trade online, we had a digital voucher scheme where businesses could get a voucher to redeem against the cost of trading online and establishing a web presence, and also get support for things like cybersecurity. And we also had support for businesses that have been disproportionately affected by Brexit, and working with the Chambers of Commerce to provide some support for those businesses that have got issues with Brexit and export documentation, making that that transition. The challenge, as always with these things, is we've got 100,000 businesses, but the amount of funding we have to support those businesses is limited. So we have to deliver the services through 3 channels really: the web channel, the business gateway, which is, if you like, a telephone help desk with 2 members of staff, and then the 21 growth managers, which are part funded by us and part funded by the local authorities in each of the 5 districts. But resources is the biggest challenge at the moment in terms of those continued capital grant programs. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very helpful. Yeah, thank you. So I have been keeping my eye on the room as well. So there were a few people with their hands up, and I'm pretty sure I've got them in the right order. So Councillor Hames.
Thanks, Chair. When you're talking about self-employment, I think that one of the things I'm coming across is that it's extremely difficult for a young person moving into business to get a business account with the financial institutions. And what I've come across is, because they can't easily open a business account because they have no record of trading, they're having to buy financial banking services from accountants. And this is taking their competitive edge off the marketplace for them. So I think that while you're looking at self-employment as a way out, an increase in employment, you need to get the financial institutions on board with you to stop all this red tape that prevents them from opening accounts.
If I may, Chairman, if I can come back on that, that's a really good point, and it was raised with us during the pandemic, and in response to that, through Sir Roger Marsh, we pulled together all the banking sector, the northern directors of the main clearing banks. We had a discussion with them, and it was with regard to new businesses wanting to start up during the pandemic, that the banks basically said, we're not opening any new business bank accounts at all. And we found that there were lots of people wanting to set up businesses but couldn't open an account. Exactly the point that you've made. Anyway, we had the round table with the banking sector, and clearly it was an issue. But the outcome of that was, it suddenly changed when the challenger banks like Starling and a couple of others the online banks were coming up with an alternative offer. And we did quite a lot of lobbying on that, and eventually the banks did start to open new bank accounts, but were very selective about it. In terms of our role, through the LEP chairman and Sir Roger Marsh and the LEP board, we were able to lobby and get some of those messages back to the banks, and I think they've now relaxed that. It is now possible to open a new business bank account with one of the clearing banks, but it was a concern, and the challenger banks actually stepped in to fill that gap. But what it meant was that choice was limited. It was a concern.
We had a similar situation to this after the war, when there were a lot of people that were put out of work and they were trying to set up in business. And I can remember casting my mind back to my father setting up in business, and he did get assistance from a couple of different institutions, but they were English-based banks. Now we're in a situation where we've got international-based banks, and they design their policies gained on what the international market's doing, and they don't particularly serve the interests of a particular country.
I think there's definitely a market to look at alternative sources of finance, particularly for small enterprises and cooperatives. And there's a number of different models that have been explored, and that perhaps is something that we need to look at going forward.
Thanks, Brian. Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Chair. Is there any opportunity for us to do more to increase or improve communication links between peers? I'm thinking of businesses where there's only 1 or 2 employees. A couple of friends have set a business up together. Quite often they might feel more vulnerable and not quite sure as to who to ask when they need advice. And if there was some sort of network where they could talk to other people in the similar business, similar trade, that might just give them any advantage. The examples I've got, my husband's business, he only permanently employs 3 people, but he has 50 freelance employees, well, potential employees on his books as well. So during the pandemic, we became quite a bit of a hub, so that everybody was worried, didn't know what they could claim, how to do it. Some of them had become limited companies, some of them were still sole traders. We became sort of a bit of a hub, and everyone was coming through us to talk to everybody else and find out what they could do, what they couldn't do. So I think it benefited a lot of people having that network. Another example is our milkman. Our milkman can now go on holiday occasionally because he's found another milkman that they're actually sharing those sort of dates with. So he will cover for the other guy while he goes on holiday, and the other guy will cover for him while he goes on holiday. And it's all really down to knowing who's doing what and who can support.
Yeah, I completely agree. Peer group learning is a really powerful thing. And again, I think, looking forward, if we can look to establish electronic communities of interest for small businesses working with partners, then I think that's something that, that we should do. During the pandemic, we ran business resilience webinars and sort of one-to-many events for businesses where they had an opportunity to compare notes. But I think it's a good suggestion, and it's something that we should definitely explore going forward.
Thank you. Next, I have Councillor Brooks.
Thank you, Chair. I think I initially indicated when people were talking about low-skilled jobs. My background is in retail, and I know full well that it's not a low-skilled job. So I think the way that we're forced to use those terms is really damaging to people's view of retail work and hospitality work, and probably feeds into some of the labour shortages that those areas are seeing. But I think on top of that, there's that view of that type of work as low skilled, then low pay is included in that. But I'm not being funny, but if you want a skilled person who can make your coffees, and it's going to take you a few weeks to train them up and everything, meanwhile bad coffee's being made, like, surely it's better to pay someone a better wage so that they don't leave your company. So that was a point I wanted to make, but I'd also just like to draw attention to the term inclusive growth, because really we should be aiming towards an inclusive economy rather than focusing on inclusive growth, because it's inferred that the only part of the economy that is inclusive is the growth aspect of it. And I'm not sure that that's something that we should be going for in West Yorkshire. We want the whole economy to be inclusive. And when we talk about this part on page 19, sustainable environment, we should maybe be switching to talking about sustainable growth rather than just the environment. What else have I got written down here? Oh yeah, so yeah, it was encouraging earlier to hear that the living wage can be used as a sort of bargaining chip for investment, but I would like to see a bit more around that, like what more can be done to encourage a living wage. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and firstly, apologies to you members for being late. The point on inclusive growth, there's no single best phrase in this space. I think they all have their problems. So using the word growth is a conscious choice at this stage. The term inclusive economy implies that it could be achieved without growth, that inclusion could be achieved without growth. And I think in the current environment, the view is that it is very hard to achieve an inclusive economy without growing that economy at the same time, so that you're growing a bigger economy, more productive economy, and encouraging inclusion through that, the more fairer spread of that. But it isn't the aim of certainly of the recovery plan or our other strategies that only the growth bit is inclusive. It's using growth to build an inclusive economy. It's that way around. And that's reflected in the productivity and business resilience strategy that we've recently republished. We think the key route through, and government is increasingly coming to this view as well, that a key route to making the economy, to grow the economy and make it more inclusive, is to improve the productivity of the economy. And then that leads through into driving, gives the opportunity for businesses such as the coffee business that you've highlighted to pay higher wages. In terms of what we're doing around higher wages, we've got a Fair Work Charter, which is a key mayoral pledge, which is in development and will be developed in detail at the beginning of next year and formally launched. And a key part of that is that we would expect employers who join that charter, receive that charter award, to be paying the real living wage.
Thanks. I'll come back to you in a minute. I've got a couple of points I wanted to make myself, and I was trying to leave them till near the end. So, where do I start? You mentioned quotas, Brian, about 50% women and 20% BAME in relation to employment. Yeah, and it always worries me when we start talking about quotas. There are areas of deprivation, clearly. There are specific barriers potentially in certain communities, but I don't like the quota thing. It worries me, because what it means to me is you are not creating a level playing field. And one thing that I believe we should have above anything else is a level playing field. So maybe it's my understanding, but also if we go back to educational attainment, there is one group that fares the worst, and that's white working class boys. Okay, so if you were to then say that white working class boys are not going to be supported by virtue of the fact that they're not BAME or female, then that to me seems counterproductive. Now, all of this, can be construed as contentious, which is not really meant to be. I don't have an issue with looking at areas of deprivation. In fact, I encourage it. If an area has got very little employment opportunities, if an area has got, deprivation for multiple reasons, then we need to get that area, what's the word, more into, where the opportunities are there, okay? And those areas may include more BAME people living in that area. But that's not the same thing. I don't like the definition of ethnicity or of sex or gender, whatever we're going to call it, defining, you're not born, we can't choose how we're born, we're all born how we're born. You're not born with a life map simply because of who you are. The area you live in, the surroundings, the people you're influenced by, those are all significant factors, but you're not born that way because of the color of your skin or the sex. That your opportunities through life are dictated by much more. It's a crude measurement, and a quota is a crude way of fixing an issue, is my point, and it worries me when we go down this road.
May I come back on that, Chair? I think what we want to do is provide enterprise support for all. And when we're commissioning business support services, we need to agree a set of targets to hold providers to account to. So I think it's less about quotas, but more about targeting different communities in a way which ensures that that we're delivering support to all sections of society, whether it's white working class, BAME communities, female entrepreneurs, or other disadvantaged or marginalised groups. So the support's there for everybody, but we need to understand whether we're delivering services that reflect the communities that we serve. Because what's really important to all of us, I think, is that we reach some of those hard to reach communities. And the only way we can determine whether or not we're reaching those hard to reach communities is to set some targets to say, well, actually, if 20% of our business support is delivered to, how can I put it? Let me put it another way. We've recently done an exercise to map out the business support services that we've delivered across West Yorkshire over the index of multiple deprivation, so that we can see that the services that we're delivering, something like 80% of the services that we're delivering, are going into areas that are high on the level of deprivation. And I think we have to monitor whether or not we're actually reaching some of those hard to reach communities, and that requires us to set targets. But that doesn't drive the wrong behaviours. It actually makes us more inclusive in terms of the work that we're doing. If that's a helpful explanation.
Yeah, yes and no. I agree with you about going to the disadvantaged communities. I disagree with you about the way the crude measurement that you describe. But I don't think we're going to get past that today. Point to note, my view will not change. Councillor Hames, you wanted another question? I'll come back to you, Harpreet, in a second.
Thanks, Chair. On the question of economic growth, should we, as a combined authority, be supporting the Freeport, Humberside Freeport?
Yes, broadly. I think when the opportunity to put in proposals for Freeports, we made a conscious decision not to submit one for West Yorkshire itself, which would have been based on a kind of a road-based hub type model of Freeport, which would have been innovative but allowable under what they were looking for. I think the way the Humber Freeport proposal has developed, which we monitor quite closely, is broadly helpful to our economy. There were models of it that would have been less helpful and would have raised concerns about sucking businesses away from West Yorkshire because of the more favourable model for more favourable potential treatment there. But we think that the balance of size and position and strategic focus of the Freeport is broadly helpful to the West Yorkshire economy as well. So yes, we're kind of monitoring at this stage, and will, as the proposal develops, support as required.
I agree with you there. I've been involved heavily in road transport, and I've been involved in supplying materials to building industry, and I visualize that a manufacturing base, a large manufacturing base on the Humberside would be of benefit to our particular area, not only from a transport point of view, but from supplying a feeder manufacturing base into the manufacturing sector within the Humberside Freeport. And we could have the equivalent of Europe's Rotterdam in the UK, with the estuary and the infrastructure that's already in existence, the bridge, and with a bit of improvement to the rail links. I think we could have a great opportunity.
Thanks. Councillor Upall, I'll come to you in a second. So,
Oh, thank you, Chair. I mean, just on the point that you made, I do agree with what you're doing. I think it is important, and we know a lot of time women are underrepresented in entrepreneurship. And I think the important point is, I know you mentioned quotas, Chair, but the important thing is evidence-based what you're doing. So as long as you can back the evidence around it, I think that's the crucial bit around it as well. In terms of your work, I mean, you mentioned universal credit and the impact that is having on low-income communities. We know actually people who are affected by UC are probably affected by lots of other things around energy and all the rest of it. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about if you're doing any work with communities that face multiple disadvantage, and are we doing any, for example, co-production work with them in terms of economic policy with the communities themselves?
So it's a really good question. I'm trying to give a good answer. So I think we are doing some, and I think we need to do more. Is the answer? So at the point where we were developing what was the local industrial strategy, and has become various things, but a good chunk of it is in the productivity plan. We did quite an extensive consultation exercises in partnership with local authorities, because they've got the best contacts kind of on the ground. But I think it's fair to say that, I mean, it kind of comes back to the point that Councillor Collins was making about, businesses knowing who to talk to and so on, is that there is a tendency for particular types of businesses and communities to engage with policy consultation exercise, and it's something that we're very alert to, and again why we kind of monitor kind of from an inclusion point of view across our policy consultation as well. I think with the arrival of the mayor, I think it's going to ramp up. It is ramping up. We've got a mayor who wants us to demonstrate to her that we are getting the views of all those communities there and all those views. We are going through an exit. There's also an issue of representation, we are trying to. There are a small number, but quite limited, but small number of representative organisations who represent those groups. But we have people like the Leeds Community Foundation on the LEP board. We're engaging with the Asian Business Association, and we're also going through an exercise of refreshing the private sector membership of all of our committees. So if you look at the culture committee that we've just set up, I think it's fair to say it's not exactly there yet, but it's a much more diverse, and we've gone through a conscious exercise of thinking, right, have we got someone who can represent this sector, this community, and so on. We've got more to do to fill in the gaps, and we're looking to do similar across all of our committees to refresh the private sector, or add to the private sector membership of all of our committees. So I think there's a few things there that we have done, but I think more to do, and we've got a mayor who's insisting on it.
Thank you, and I think actually working with people with lived experience is going to be really important. I know this is something that's kind of been pushed nationally. Could I just come on to another point, if that's okay? I just wanted to ask about climate change. So in the recovery plan, you do cover environment and climate change, and obviously this is a key priority for the mayor, particularly around green skilled jobs. Can I just ask about the tension between some economic and infrastructure policies and priorities that you have, and also the work that we need to do to get to where we need to on climate change and zero carbon, or whatever the term is, sorry, I've forgotten. Given, we've just had COP26, they haven't quite got to where they wanted to either. But how do you meet that tension? I mean, the fact you've got some quite big infrastructure programs in place, road, there's always the issue around the airport and all that. So how are you meeting the tension between that and what we need to do to get to where we do on climate change and the environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a huge challenge. So I think there's probably two parts to the answer to that. I mean, on the kind of what our, where there's potentially negative impacts, like you've highlighted, roads, the airport and things like that, we're having a really good look at what our overall balance is and working with partners and local authorities about that, because as you appreciate, especially on the airport, different local authorities have different views depending on their proximity to airports and reliance and how close they are to Manchester and so on. So that's a particularly thorny issue, but our focus, certainly on the airport and on roads, is about we need to be able to see the growth potential and the support for businesses that those things provide. We're going through an exercise where we are developing carbon appraisal approaches that we're applying across all of our both new proposals coming through and existing infrastructure, so that we've got a really rounded view of the overall carbon impact. It is incredibly difficult. I mean, I'm sure you've all sat on committees approving schemes, and I certainly sit on our internal assurance processes. And when you have a road scheme where it increases capacity so that so that cars can flow through faster, but probably perhaps encourages more traffic against the existing situation where cars are stuck in a traffic jam, what's the overall carbon impact of that? And unless you do that really detailed data work, you don't get that kind of insight into that. On the more positive side, I mean, as the whole focus of the government and indeed as a theme through COP, there are huge opportunities for jobs and people through the green economy. The mayor has put this as central to her pledge with her jobs, 1,000 green jobs. And there are specific opportunities in West Yorkshire. I suppose I'd probably highlight the biggest being around home retrofit. We have a lot of poorly insulated old terraced housing throughout West Yorkshire that all needs addressing, and that's an opportunity from a business point of view. The challenge is finding the funding models to make that happen, and also to find the route into difficult to reach communities. So we've got a really exciting project that we are just launching that's come out of the Community Renewal Fund, where we're going to be doing some work with the Housing Association in Manningham, and to try and see what are the issues, how can we get that a community like that, predominantly housing association community in a difficult to reach area. How can we get them engaged, build plans for how, and then hopefully we'll be able to identify in future the funding models that makes that, and then also how do we develop the skills. So we published our climate plan last month, which kind of talks about all these different issues. But I mean, in my mind, I just kind of try and see the potential difficult bit, but also the real opportunity bit part of it as well.
Thanks. It's probably a reasonable point to have a look at the point that Bob made earlier, but we've got a couple more people waiting to speak. The other, Councillor Smith.
Am I on? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks. It's been really interesting. I'd just like to, it's kind of going back about an hour really, but looking at adult education and training and working with younger people in schools and developing the curriculum to be more sort of versatile and appropriate to developing the skills needed to be entrepreneurs. I also think there's a space in there to develop awareness of the rights of workers' rights, about low pay, holiday pay. I think there is a lot of room, and you mentioned it yourself, Brian, about, modern day slavery and, well, maybe not quite that, but the role of sort of exploitative companies taking on people as self-employed and them ending up without any rights. And I know you've covered that, but I think people have to be aware of that, because for a lot of people coming out of school, especially the people that you were talking about, young, maybe white working class people, they come out and they do get horrible labouring jobs where they're paid, well below any minimum wage. And when they're asked, they're told they're self-employed. So they've got no sort of come back to the employer. And also the other thing I noticed in the report that it talked about the resilience of co-ops and worker-owned businesses. And you also, again, you have mentioned that. I just want to know what actually is being done to sort of promote that style of business. You know, how can we look at businesses that are maybe floundering and look at a way to maybe turn them into co-ops or worker-owned, so that we can have, you know, I'm just wondering if that's, you know, an increased sort of motivation, if that increases motivation and as a result increases productivity. Thank you.
I think the workers' rights point, particularly for young people entering the labour market, is a really good one. And we, I think the unions have a role to play here as well. I think because we're considering a proposal at the moment from the TUC, which has been supported in other mayoral combined authorities, to provide support for union learning reps. And these are trade union people that are based within businesses that will promote training, increase awareness and understanding of workers' rights, whether that's a new apprentice coming into that organisation or you know, an older member of the workforce. And I think there's a really important role to play working with the TUC and the unions on improving awareness and understanding of workers' rights within the workplace. And that's something that was broadly supported, well, universally supported at the Employment and Skills Committee when it was discussed at the last meeting. So members were very supportive of that particular programme going forward. So that's something that we could do to positively sort of intervene and support that. The point on co-ops is a good one. I think that there are opportunities for us to look at alternative business support models, and I'd have to come back to you on the detail of the specific programs unless Ian can assist me on this one.
So, on the co-ops, the focus on co-ops is something the mayor's really interested in. I think we're really early days about thinking what our role might be, but she introduced this idea in her manifesto of establishing a cooperative development and community wealth building function. So we're doing some thinking at the moment about what that might look like. On a specific example, the mayor's really interested in how that model, so it comes back to Councillor Collins' point again, how that model could work in the culture sector. So there's already in existence a cooperative model around creative agencies, which we're having a look at, and whether we could do more to promote that kind of model. It's identifying those sectors though where that, you know, as Councillor Collins said, you know, when you're getting down to the detail of milkmen forming groups together, you know, it just demonstrates the way you've got to go sector by sector and understand the issues and the opportunities in there. So I haven't got an answer at this stage about what we will do, but it's very much on the agenda. It's kind of a new area for us. And then obviously once we've done the thinking around that, we kind of work with Brian's teams to kind of understand what we can do in practice to make that happen. So I think probably watch this space. And just on your first point about shadow self-employment and so on, I think it's a really good point that would take away that, you know, we need to make sure that our Fair Work Charter covers that situation. I mean, I think we need to think about whether businesses who operate that kind of model are anywhere close to signing a Fair Work Charter, but we need to at least try. But there is a balance there that the kind of the whole gig economy, which is, you know, massive focus in recent years, that is viewed quite positively by some people that participate in it as well, and finding that line between people who are being exploited and people who actually it's a positive part of their kind of working style and how they want to earn a wage is quite a difficult line. It's quite a difficult line to draw. So yeah, I think Fair Work Charter is our key kind of intervention on in that space.
Thanks, Ian. I think that last point you made is a very important one, actually. There's a differentiation between those people who are possibly exploited and those people who I've done that type of work in the past myself, and it suited my lifestyle at the time. I'm not an expert in this, but I do wonder whether sometimes the employers that my colleague was referring to, the exploitative employers, I'm wondering whether they are less the known businesses and more of I wouldn't call it a black market economy, but like a less formalized employment situation where maybe people are not on the books as much. I don't know. I'm not an expert in this, but I don't know. There's a bit potential another sort of level of business, isn't there?
I think it's certainly true. It's more prominent in that space, but then we have seen some really high profile cases of that have been challenged, and where some large employers have been using disguised employment, using self-employment to kind of disguised employment, and in all honesty, our tools and levers in that space are quite limited as an authority. It's very much a national government type issue, and they have shown some appetite to tighten the rules in that space. But I think, as Councillor Smith says, it's about making sure we're doing what we can, working with the unions and so on, to raise awareness that there is protection there in some cases, and make sure that people are getting it.
Thanks. I believe Councillor Hames has another point.
Thanks, Chair. Just coming back to the green issue, briefly, I heard somebody mention hydroelectric power. Is there any examples within the combined authority of any schemes?
Not that I can think of.
I can't think of any.
No. No, I can't think of any hydroelectric on the books. Our focus has been, as our climate plan says, it's a bit agnostic on the generating side of the kind of debate. We're looking very much at transport and buildings as being the key things that we need to tackle in the short term. I think the key issue, we design in photovoltaic where we can. Some of the schemes, so things like bus stations, Wellington House, our headquarters has had it designed in. But one of the issues up until very recently has been the government's lack of position on the national approach, the national strategy around generation, and what's going to be the importance of hydrogen within that compared to renewables. So I think we're getting a better picture of now that we think that it looks like the government's moving down the route of home heating being predominantly electric based, and hydrogen being reserved more for the heavy industry type uses. And I think we'll be, if that kind of proves to be the case, we'll be pushing our plans along in that direction, I would imagine.
Most solutions to the green problem depend heavily on electricity, and vehicles, for example, is a whole new sector that's never ever placed any demand on the generation of electricity, which is a completely new sector. So I think that the attention to make it successful is going to be on the generation side. And if you look at what is on offer, wind generation is a bit unpredictable. Solar panels would take up too much space. But you look at something like hydroelectric power, and we do depend heavily, the national grid at this moment depends heavily on an hydroelectric power station in Scotland that they can switch on within 2 minutes if ever there's the threat of a shutdown, a blackout. So I think with the dependency that we have now on our international neighbours for the supply of electric, we ought to be looking at small schemes, and the number of reservoirs we have in this country and the number of weirs on rivers and small scale. I think, having looked at a scheme that were introduced in Reading, down in Berkshire, is it, which is supplying Reading now with renewable electricity, I think that seriously, as a combined authority, we ought to be looking at this.
Yeah, just following on from that, I think that I've always thought actually that we have a lot of rivers which are fast flowing, and water turbines could be driven. And I know one businessman in the Hebden Bridge, he actually provides us all the electricity for his work through a water turbine, and it used to be a mill, a water mill, and so the basic thinker structure was there, and he managed to fit a turbine there, which does provide him through. And there's a lot of other cases, where some of the things, wherever there's a weir, you can have a turbine, and there's plenty of weirs on our river. So I think that is one place where you can go to look at to relatively low infrastructure costs, I think, which will bring results.
Well, thanks for that, Stephen. I think it's a fair point, actually, because it wasn't that long ago we had a lot of water generated mills, and but ultimately, I used to think we needed more mountains like they've got in Scotland, but it's not necessarily the case at all, is it? But there's a big problem, isn't there, with this, with regards to generation of electricity, if we're going to use stacks more of it, because National Grid is probably not going to be coping with what it requires. But I'm not an expert on this either, so Ian, please, yeah.
Just to differentiate the two issues that the councillors have raised there, I think absolutely we would be. I think what we see with there's a small scale, I think, hydro scheme at a very, very old one at up on the wharf. There's one at Grassington, I think, as well. But they are very small scale because of the flows the river. And I think what we, the area that we would be looking as an authority would be support, like you say, exactly those businesses who are located close to those opportunities and supporting them if that was something they felt. I mean, I don't think we've got any examples, but hey, a business came forward saying we think we can generate our electricity this route. I mean, why not? I think the issue that Councillor Haynes was raising was the kind of much more macro scale overall generation of electricity for the country and that sustainable supply, and I think that's where we have less of a role, but apart from one of actually lobbying and working with government and with the electricity suppliers and so on, which we do, and as he says, the key issue is that is storage effectively, and opportunities for using hydro for storage. So I used to live somewhere which was 100% self-sufficient on wind power overnight. Couldn't add any more turbines though, because had nowhere to store the electricity. It was quite frustrating because we could have done a lot more. And I think that's where we need to be looking at these. How do we smooth out the power supply so that it can run at times when there isn't wind and sun.
Yeah, it's very windy where I live. It'd be nice to get free electric. I'm not sure I've got room for a windmill. Councillor Ahmed, you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment first of all. Hard to reach communities, it's not a really good term, to be fair, and I don't agree with it, because it almost puts blame on the community, saying that you're not open to us reaching out to you. So it all depends on how people approach them, how businesses and organisations approach them. I think we need to step away from using that sort of a term, because it just encloses blame onto communities. And my question is, going back to a point that was raised earlier on with regards to the recent level of job-to-job movement, what encouragement and assistance is being provided or can be provided to organisations who have got job-to-job movement and the need to backfill the roles that have been vacant? Because obviously any empty spaces in organisations is, it's economic deficit, isn't it, really? What are we doing to support? And another issue that you mentioned earlier on was the older generation of employees who find themselves out of work. Is there any encouragement being offered to organisations to take on those people who have got a vast amount of experience in various fields, and they can be slotted into roles where these organisations need people to come into? So if you've got any comments on that? Thank you.
Can I just interject before you answer, please? Just on that point, do we have any evidence, the people you're referring to here and the question, the people who've retired early, do we have any evidence that these people have done so voluntarily and are having difficulty getting back into work, is it a choice they've made, or is it something that's been forced upon? Is there any evidence either way? I mean, just to add on to that question.
So most of the evidence is at national level because of the sort of granularity of it. But what the evidence tends to suggest is that the number of people re-entering employment after being made redundant, who are sort of older workers during the recent period, the number re-entering employment is lower than it was pre-pandemic and in previous periods. So that would tend to imply that people, and there can be a range of barriers, sort of health reasons, but it does tend to suggest that there's a kind of lower propensity to go back into work in view of the fact that we've got quite a tight labour market. So I'm not sure it's fully understood because it's quite a recent development, but I think the basic evidence is the rate of return into employment after being made redundant for older workers is lower than it was.
If I may just come in on the second point, which is about the employment vacancies and matching people up to the employment vacancies. The role of the employment hub is to bring together groups of employers and their vacancies and match them up to individuals that are looking for work or training. So we've got that kind of brokerage service where we support employers. And there are other incentives as well, that these are national programs where employers are encouraged to take on apprentices. And we've also got a levy transfer service where companies that have unused apprenticeship levy funding can be diverted to small and medium-sized enterprises to encourage them to recruit more apprentices from the workforce. And we work really closely with our Job Centre Plus colleagues as well to make sure that, again, we've got that safety net and we supporting companies recruit the people they need. We have another work stream as well, which is with regard to inward investment. So when a large employer could be from overseas or from another part of the UK is looking to relocate to West Yorkshire, as part of that whole package of support, we'd look at what skills needs they have, and again, we'd look to source the local workforce with the right skills for that particular investor as part of that support package.
Thanks. I'll come to you in a second, Councillor Collins. Just, I think Bob's got a question about that specific point.
Yes, I've fallen into that category in the past as my other half. And some of the problems you face once you reach a certain age in your employment life is that companies are really reluctant to talk to you, and that's because you're either overqualified, you've got too many skills, you don't fit the mold for them. So there's still this culture which essentially prevents people returning to the job market. So that tends to force people to go along the lines of self-employment. And to touch on some of the things you said earlier, it's not an easy choice to make, and you have to wear many hats and you have to develop a completely different set of skills, because if you work for big business, sat behind you is an enormous network of support. When you work for yourself, the buck stops with you, and that's a lot of responsibility to take on board. So I think this thing of over 50s coming out of work, the likelihood of them returning to the occupation they used to do or something similar is very slight. And that needs to be addressed both at a national level and at a local level, because employers just don't have the appetite to bring people in.
Sorry, I was going to just say I sort of to agree entirely. I mean, obviously, just speaking personally, I think I've just become into that category now where if I was to find myself unemployed, I'd probably find it difficult through my various factors that you mentioned, principally age, but it's a realization in the last 10 years, I believe. 10 years ago, I thought I would have probably found it very easy to readjust and make myself more employable. I'm not so sure I would now. I don't know whether there's anything either of you or any of you would like to say about that, or whether we. Okay.
I think the important factor is that there's an additional set of factors that have come into play with COVID. So those issues existed before COVID, but there are obviously existing factors at play that are further restricting people returning to the labour market. Now that could be a temporary readjustment in the labour market. I think the onus really is partly on employers to make what they offer in terms of their job opportunities more attractive to candidates, to attract them back in, but also potentially, is there a need for targeted sort of employment support for people who are out of the labour market to enable them to return if they do face issues around health and so on. But say it's not known yet whether it is just a temporary readjustment in the economy or whether a long-term sort of structural thing is kicked in.
Yeah, I don't think it's one size fits all, is it either? Because I think we've seen some large companies have made an awful lot of effort to employ people probably 15 years older than I am. But the fact is that people's situations are different. I've still got young kids, for example, whereas if I was 15 years older, I wouldn't have. So your requirements are different. So everybody's different, aren't they? So you had a Councillor Felstead.
I mean, kind of the follow-up to that is once you reach a certain stage in your career, particularly when you move up in management circles, you're under constant threat because in my particular industry, there seemed to be a round of looking at how the business was performing, and every 2 years you'd go through statutory redundancies. So even if you managed to jump into a new company, you knew that that was going to be an ongoing issue because you land somewhere else and you've got exactly the same thing going on. Where you're going to make the majority of your cost cutting, it's not down at the bottom, it's always at the top because you've reached your top of your pay grade or whatever. And that's the way business tends to work.
Councillor Collins, your question, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to go back to the green agenda a bit. First, I don't need a description today, but green jobs. What exactly are green jobs? I don't know whether the mayor's team are putting something together, but I would like something fairly soon on that, if you can obtain it for us. The second thing is I like the hydro power idea. Is that within our remit to look at that? Because it doesn't matter if we generate. I see that the generation of electricity in the future is going to be a lot of micro schemes rather than one big power station. There's going to be small solar farms. There's going to be small wind farms, and we have a history of using water power in Yorkshire. So is there something we can look at with that? It doesn't matter if we generate too much electricity, we just put it in the national grid. I mean, we don't have to have our own storage cells or anything. So that would be very interesting if we could look at that, and also maybe do something with Lancashire as well, because they've got a similar history as ourselves with regard to mills using water power. Is there any way we could link up with them to see whether there's something that both of us could look at in the future? So those were my 2 points on the green. Oh, sorry, there was a third. The other is in Leeds, we've got the RERF, the recycling of waste, which is generating heating for a lot of our city centre and communities. Do we have that across the whole of the combined authority, or is there potential to increase and put other facilities in it elsewhere within the combined authority? Do we still have landfill basically at the end of the day?
Can I just say before you answer that, I think there are three sort of separate points in that, and just one of them sort of almost policy making as opposed to scrutinising. But yeah, the other two, yeah, quite happy with.
Yes, green jobs is very thought. Yes, we are doing what so the Green Jobs Task Force with the Mayor's commitment it will be launched. I think it's going to be early next year. And at the heart of that is going to need to be a definition. So my team is working on an exact definition of what we need by green jobs, because there's a temptation to draw the net very widely, but then it's not as meaningful to people. And there's some other things that can, people will position as green jobs not. So we have already opened up the portal for employers to help us to identify green jobs. So we've got people, I think we've had a couple of 100 or 300 jobs identified where employers come forward. So these are green jobs that I'm intending to create, and that gives us a bit of a feel what they mean. So yes, there will be more to come on that. I think my point on hydro is that I don't think I will take it back to the team and see what, if there's anything specifically we need to do to encourage that small scale opportunity. I think the point I was making at generation is just on the scale of generation challenge that we've got in this country, over recent weeks, where even coal has come back up to, has been at points over the last few weeks 6% of our national generation. So there's still quite a challenge to solve there, and I think it's the hydro storage that might be the answer there. But it's not for us to solve that, but we do work with partners to identify that. And I think, when government talks about small scale, that term small scale is getting a little bit muddy at the moment, because they've talked about small scale, nuclear generation. They're still huge, compared to, they're just smaller than the really big nuclear scale. So I think the direction of travel doesn't seem to be very large numbers of generation plants. It's large numbers of things like solar sites and so on. But the government's direction still seems to be large scale, wind generation, for example. So, we participate in that debate, and but don't deliver it on large scale. And I wasn't sure, I didn't understand your third point, I'm afraid.
It used to be called the incinerator, but
Right.
it's proper an acronym, it's RERF.
The recovery plant, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's just whether we've got those other facilities throughout the combined authority, because I think the one in Leeds just really covers Leeds at the moment.
Yes, I think that would be a local authority issue. I don't think we don't have a role in any of those plants.
We have an incinerator in Kirklees, but there's been talk for years about using the heat generated for other things, but I think it's very expensive. I think the point about green jobs is a really good one, actually, and it's specific to a mayoral pledge, which I like as chair of a scrutiny committee, because we can actually scrutinise what's been promised and what's been delivered. But the devil is in the detail with this type of thing, isn't it? Because there is a tendency when an economic opportunity is on offer, everyone tailors their marketing almost to say we're a green job, or we are offering a green job. And it's very important that if we're going to scrutinise this delivery of green jobs, we understand what a green job looks like. And I think you've answered the question, but it's a good point. I think I'll come to you in a second. There's two other people as well, but Councillor Felsted mentioned earlier about skill sets required for green solutions, green jobs, effectively. So there is clearly a shortage nationally and in this region of people with the skills required to do certain things that we're going to need in the future to do what we're loosely terming as a green job. So that's a really important point, isn't it? If these green jobs are going to be delivered, first people have got to have the skills with which to be employed to do them. So I think that's a fair point. Can we just briefly sort of mention, if there is a plan, what that looks like?
Now, the green skills, it's a really good point, just at a practical level. So I think I may have mentioned this before, but I was at a meeting in Halifax and somebody said, well, I've got an electric car, but I have to drive to Leeds to get the electric car serviced because we haven't got a garage with people with the right skills. So of course, in terms of our role as a combined authority with a devolved adult education budget, we need to make sure that we're commissioning through the colleges and some of the private training providers the skills that we need for tomorrow, whether that's motor vehicle engineering for electric vehicles or some other green job. And again, as Ian said, you know, the task force will identify a much sharper definition of what a green job is. But I think the important thing is that we understand what skills we've got in the current labour market now and what we're going to need going forward based on the demand for green jobs and green skills. And just understanding what that means, whether that's fitting, you know, heat exchangers on domestic premises or carrying out energy audits on domestic premises and such like. I mean, these are just examples that spring to mind, but clearly there's a big skills gap that will need to be filled. And we can contribute to filling that gap through the commissioning role that we have with the Employment and Skills Committee and the Adult Education Budget.
There's clearly an opportunity as well to look at transferable skills. There'll be people that have got, sorry, I didn't realise you were about to speak.
Chair.
Yeah, carry on, please.
It was just to say that we have in the works, we've got a research project to carry out a skills audit looking at particularly sort of skills needed for net zero, but also wider environmental requirements as well. And it is quite a complex task in terms of the sort of myriad of jobs that will be shaped by the low carbon agenda in a substantial way, in a genuine way. So capturing all of that is quite, and kind of scoping that piece of work is quite a challenge, but it's something that will be going to the partnership in January for their review as well. So work is underway to try and assess what the scale of that challenge is. I think one of the challenges is the kind of emerging needs. It's a kind of chicken and egg issue. So if we're to achieve net zero, those skills will be needed, but at the moment the demand is not there in the marketplace. So some of the retrofit stuff, for example, we need to retrofit homes in order to achieve net zero. There isn't consumer demand for those retrofit solutions at the moment at sufficient scale. So people like Leeds College of Building, do they invest in the capacity to deliver those skills, which they can do in a lot of areas, if they're not assured of the kind of throughput of students? So there are challenges around which obviously we have to resolve around addressing those green skill needs in the sort of short to medium term.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned something I was going to say as well, and it's something I keep coming back to. It's about the education establishments, universities, colleges, etc., providing the training that's required locally. And, you know, clearly, if people are going to be required into these jobs, then there will be extra training. You know, university courses, higher education establishments will have to be, you know, and people are qualified in industries where transferable skills, you know, like people with electrical qualifications, clearly are going to be semi-qualified to do some kind of, you know, I'm generalizing, but you know where I'm going. But there's also issues with this old, you know, I've got an older house. I'd be terrified about having a heat pump in the current situation because I'd be worried that my wife was going to be complaining about being cold every winter. Now, it could be that a heat pump would be enough to keep her warm, in which case my life would be a lot easier. But at the moment, I'm a little bit worried that a big old house with poor insulation, and yeah, I could probably improve the insulation, but I'm a little bit worried that it might not be warm enough. And once you've made that transition and spent an awful lot of money, it's not really easy to go back. There is another question from Councillor Smith. So we have only got just over 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about, is there a research and development budget, and how is that driven, if there is one? I mean, are we sort of driving in any research? And also just one other comment, I do think that the green agenda, it doesn't go hand in hand with growth, and I think we've got to be really careful and look at what we've actually got just now, because there's loads of skills that we could use just now to make a greener economy, and I think we should be investing in them.
Just on the question of the research and development budget, we do have, so the research and intelligence team within the combined authority that covers the economic issues, transport, to some extent environmental intelligence as well. We do, obviously we have a budget, but I don't think we have a formal research and development budget. I think we have agreed priorities between the research team and the policy team around areas where we need to develop both our intelligence and then lead that into policy and strategy development. But I don't think we don't have a kind of formal research and development budget, for example, or prospectus that people could bid into or anything of that nature. But we do have clear priorities and we have the resources, although limited, to try and address those.
Commission research, don't we, and impact assessments.
Yes, yes. So it's identifying where the gaps are in our knowledge and then filling them. The other aspect of that, where we work very closely with the universities through the Yorkshire Universities organisation, and a recent development there is that that they have appointed what they call a CAPE fellow, who is working dedicated with us now to try and marshal the huge range of skills and experience in the research community around our universities there, to try and focus it down onto the questions that we need answering for the region. So for example, they are doing some work now to further develop the economic scenario work within the economic recovery plan, to make it more of a dedicated, to do more on the dedicated West Yorkshire forecast. So that's a really big step forward for us in terms of amalgamating all the research and intelligence resources in the region. I think on your second point, I think that's absolutely and you know, a key drive between the kind of the change in focus in the latest version of the economic recovery plan is the mayor's focus on a fair and just recovery, and the green agenda is part of that. You know, it provides us with some opportunities for businesses and for new jobs in new areas and different skills and so on. But the mayor's focus is that needs to be that is there because there's also some, because as we decarbonise, there's some industries that become less viable or disappear completely. In a way, it's a similar situation playing out in a different way as when the coal industry was declining. I think the difference is, and there is a whole body of research around a just transition. The difference is that the decline of the coal industry was impacted very heavily on specific communities. I think the decarbonisation impacts more widely, probably every bit as big an impact, but the interventions that we need to see to avoid the situation that we saw, where people are disenfranchised and excluded from the market because their skill set becomes no longer required. That's a clear area of focus for the recovery.
Thank you, Ian. I'm going to just say this is the last question, I think. Councillor Brooks.
Sorry, Chair, it was just in relation to what you were saying about heat pumps. If you get a properly qualified installer, like installation technician, they can work out exactly how powerful the system needs to be for your home. So there's no need to worry about it if that's what you're wanting to invest in.
Thanks for that. I was going to say I was going to pay for it. Cool. So we've come to the end. We need to leave this room in 2.5 minutes. So I'd like to thank you all for your participation. Thanks to Brian, Ian and Peter and Khaled for the preparation of the reports and everything that's done in the background, which is quite a lot. Actually, I've realised how much work goes into preparation of this for us to look over. The next meeting is, when you can find his notes, the 19th of January. So I'm sure we will correspond before then, but thank you all for your attendance and see you next time.